All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to day 3 of SABR Virtual. For those of you that have not jumped in yet during these sessions, a couple of quick reminders for you. We want to maintain a healthy bandwidth for our presenters. So we are asking that everyone who is not a presenter today, not involved in the programming, go ahead and keep your video off. Otherwise, as hosts, we'll turn it off for you. But it's a lot easier if you would be willing to do us that favor. Today we have a couple of research presentations, one from Dr. Lindsay Bell and one from Mr. Andy McCue. In addition to that, when we get done with the research presentations, we will be conducting this year's SABR annual business meeting with the board of directors. So I want to get started here in relatively short fashion. But I do want to mention one quick thing here before we get started. We do have a virtual raffle associated with this. For just $5, you can enter the SABR virtual raffle, have a chance to win some cool baseball memorabilia. For more, go to sabr.org/virtual meetings and link to the raffle page. We'll announce those winners on July 26th as we get to the end of the SABR virtual conference. Our first research presenter today is Dr. Lindsay Bell. Lindsay John Bell is currently an assistant professor of history at Bemidji State University. I'm from Minnesota. I know it's very cold there in the winter. He earned his doctorate in history from Iowa State University in May 2020. His dissertation, Reconstructing Baseball's Image, Landis, Cobb, and the Baseball Hero Ethos, 1917 to 1947, explores the politicization, easy for me to say, of baseball during Landis's tenure as commissioner. His research seeks to understand how the First World War influenced the sports hero paradigm. Lindsay has presented papers at the 2018 and 2019 9 Spring Training Conference and at the 2019 Cooperstown Symposium and Baseball and American Culture at the Baseball Hall of Fame. He has been a SABR member since 2016 and a baseball fan his entire life. Dr. Lindsay John Bell, please take the floor.
Thank you. And what I'm presenting today is sort of going to be a snapshot of my dissertation. And I have my Twitter handle on there. If you are Twitter savvy, you're more than welcome to give me a follow and keep up with what I'm tweeting about with baseball and baseball history. And where I want to start, coincidentally, the timing of this and my presentation is 102 years ago today, July 11th, 1918. This is game 1 of a doubleheader between the Boston Braves and Chicago Cubs at Wigman Park. And this was actually a makeup game from one that was rained out earlier in the season. And as baseball fans, we all know that a box score can only tell us so much about what goes on in a game. And with this particular game, I'm more interested in not what went on the field that the box score does not reveal. I'm more interested in what happened in the stands during this game. Midway through game 1, agents of the American Protective League infiltrated Wigman Park. Some of the agents stood guard at the gates and locked it to prevent anybody from leaving. Others started to make their way through the stands, while some went to the press box to make an announcement that every man in attendance that day was going to be searched. And if he could not show evidence of his government-issued registration card, he was going to be arrested. So the APL had formed in 1917, actually as an extension of the government, and its goal was to enforce patriotism and stifle dissent. And that's what they were there to do that day, to force men to honor their patriotic duty and register for the draft if they had not done so. And when all is said and done, the APL, just in that location, had apprehended 500 men. Now, this was part of an entire citywide sweep that day. But what's interesting to note, and why I want to start here, is that not one man targeted in the raid at Wigman Park was a ball player. And this began to sort of bring out and expose this growing tension between the government, the War Department, and organized baseball, and what was expected of an entire nation that was mobilizing for war, and how much baseball was doing in that part. And so if we go back to the beginning of the war, the United States enters in the spring of 1917, we can see that baseball is taking some steps to try to present itself as becoming part of this war effort. So led by the Yankees, teams are hiring drill sergeants to drill the players and to have them march in formation and pregame ceremonies. Both Charles Ebbets and Charles Comiskey, they convert their offices into military recruitment centers. Of course, there's the famous Bat and Ball Fund launched by Clark Griffith to provide baseball equipment to soldiers at bases at home and those on the trenches in France. And then, of course, there's Hank Gowdy, the catcher for the Boston Braves, who volunteers in 1917 to enlist. And so, of course, baseball is trying to, they're going to highlight Gowdy and his enlistment as sort of, this is what all Americans can expect of ball players. They're all in some ways like a Hank Gowdy. But, clearly the owners had this belief that their greatest contribution to the war effort was the nation's morale. So publicly and out in the open, all of these things look great. But behind closed doors, we see that there's not this sort of unified and genuine commitment for this all-out mobilization. And one of these we see here in this board meeting of the NL Board of Directors in December of 1917, in which at one point during the meeting, Charles Ebbets makes a motion that there should be $50,000 set aside in the coming year for the league to purchase Liberty bonds. And you would think that if the league is fully on board, this would be a non-issue to just approve and move forward on. But Pittsburgh Pirates owner Barney Dreyfuss objects, and it's not on the grounds that he doesn't want to buy Liberty bonds, but he actually wants to let everyone know that he has a broker that will sell them bonds for 3 cents cheaper than they can buy from the government. And of course, Ebbets is sort of, taken aback a bit by this proposition. And he responds as, well, that's not patriotic. To which Dreyfuss, sort of, well, we're business. This is not about patriotism. And Branch Rickey actually sides with Dreyfuss in this sort of back and forth. He agrees this looks like an investment opportunity for the league if they can find a way to maximize their profits in support of the war in some capacity. Why not follow through on that? Now, nothing is resolved in this particular moment with this exchange, but clearly it shows that behind closed doors in these private meetings, this commitment to the war by the owners is not what it appeared publicly. And this now then is brought out into the public in 1918 with the worker fight order. So issued in May of 1918 by Provost General Enoch Crowder, the worker fight order essentially mandated that all draft eligible men had to either register for the draft or find employment in a war-related industry. Now, the government said that it was only targeting men who were in non-essential occupations. But when the order is issued, there's a question as to where does baseball fit in this? Is baseball essential? Is it non-essential? So there was questions about whether or not ball players would be exempt from this order. Now, the government had already established that entertainers were essential workers for trying to obviously keep the country's morale high during wartime. But was baseball entertainment? And so obviously the owners are trying to make their case. They're writing to government officials. Barney Dreyfuss says that there's no American more bang for their buck as far as entertainment than with baseball, right? So they're trying to push players into this entertainment category, all the while waiting for the government to actually hand down its decision. But the problem is, baseball in the decades before the war had built, its sort of importance within the American experience as sort of a realm in which boys became men, and was also in some ways interchangeable with the skills required for soldiering. So this sort of athlete warrior ethos that had been pushed and promoted by baseball was a way for them to assert its importance to the nation before the war. And now they had to sort of rectify all of this propaganda with the worker fight order, because clearly if baseball is supposedly the realm in which men are equipped with the skills to become great soldiers, then why aren't ball players enlisting in droves, and why is baseball still going on essentially in 1918, and the worker fight order really exposing this, and eventually Secretary of War Newton D. Baker rules against baseball. He hands down his decision that baseball is non-essential, gives the league until September 1st to fold and close the season. And he actually sort of invokes some of this athlete warrior ethos in his decision, saying, well, there's something, about baseball players, right? They're really athletic. They'd make great soldiers. They'd be great in the war industry. So then now it's, the season has to end prematurely. And there still is resistance led by Ban Johnson, American League president, to push for a World Series beyond the cutoff that Baker had allowed. And Johnson's argument is that, well, it's sort of, he didn't really specify that we couldn't play a World Series, even though he didn't specifically say they could. And this, created quite a bit of tension amongst league leaders. John Tenner resigns shortly after the decision the league makes to push forward with a World Series. So baseball sort of, inflicts itself with a black eye in this resistance to all-out mobilization during the war. And at the end of the season, the Chicago Daily Tribune editorial board writes a scathing column, sort of indicting all of baseball as these slackers, right? These men who failed to live up to their civic obligations and demands of the war. Of course, we know the war ended in the fall of 1918. So the owners and the players didn't have to worry about, if the war had extended into the following season. But of course, we all know what happens in 1919. With the World Series. And even though the scandal itself did not really come out into the open until 1920, the fact that this happens right on the heels of what was going on between the league and the government during the war just exacerbates sort of the image of baseball as a whole. And if we take a step back further and we think about what is happening nationally as all this is going on. Well, in these post-war years, there's rampant xenophobia, the first Red Scare, so the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia sent, a shockwave throughout the entire world, especially Western democracies. What will happen if we are infiltrated, and all of these subversives within our nation will rise up and attempt to overthrow the government as well. So this sort of construct then, in this very bifurcated understanding of good and bad men, and the good men were the ones who would be out enlisting and fighting for liberty and democracy, and these other ones were questionable, these weak-minded men, these weak-willed men who would be willing to or who would be susceptible to communist rhetoric, or these men who would sell out their team and their game and the American game to throw a World Series. So they're sort of in this other nefarious category. And that's where we see Landis step in on the heels of all of these things. And he very much believes in the baseball that was promoted before the war. This is a realm that is important to Americanize not only immigrants, but native-born Americans. It is actually a place that can teach the youth what it means to be an American, civic virtue, and it turns boys into men. And Landis is obviously of a military family. He gets his name from his father, who was wounded at Kennesaw Mountain in Georgia as part of Sherman's forces going through the South. His son enlists in the First World War, became a decorated pilot, and he sort of represents this middle ground, this link between the Civil War and the First World War. And actually, there was an effort during the First World War to branch the young men who fought during the First World War with the Civil War generation as following through on the commitments that were adhered to by the Civil War generation. They were the ones who extended liberty and freedom. And it was up to this now new men of the First World War to continue in fighting in that honor of the men from the Civil War. And Landis obviously sees that connection as well. And it comes up in these speeches that he delivers, specifically in front of the American Legion, which he became very active in once it formed. And he talks about, this fine outfit of men who helped save and preserve American liberty during the First World War. They're a fine outfit, much like that fine outfit that we saw in the Civil War. And Landis, after the war as well, became very disgruntled with Americans in general, feeling like they were not honoring the veterans of the First World War properly, that they had somehow, what they asked for them to do early on when they signed up for the war, the sacrifice, now was not being honored and followed through on after the war. They've been betrayed. And so it's how do you rectify this, what is believed to be this betrayal of these brave men? Well, operating over the game, the American game, then begin this rehabilitation process, not only necessarily for baseball, but for the nation in what it needs to do to honor veterans, military. And one of the first decisions that Landis hands down is the reinstating of Joe Harris, who was banned in 1919. And when Landis has to provide his reasoning for reinstating Harris, it's simply on his war record. Right? Here is a veteran that baseball is going to honor and America should honor as well. And Landis continued his commitment with the American Legion. He was very much involved in disabled veteran programs as well. The 1922 World Series, the infamous tie game in Game 2, Landis ordered the proceeds of the gate receipts donated to the disabled American veterans of the World War. He is actively helping certain veterans rectify their cases with the government to get to seek restitution. So his commitment and efforts through the American Legion actually earned him the American Legion Distinguished Service Medal Award in 1929. And with the launch of the junior baseball program through the American Legion, then there's an opportunity now, because if the youth are the most impressionable in the nation and the ones that need the most structure to build this sort of civic-minded attitude that is supposed to help sustain this democratic experiment, then figuring out ways to develop a code of conduct within the sport itself that will be able to inculcate these ideals of civic virtue was important. So within the junior baseball program, promoting good sportsmanship also became synonymous and interchangeable with the values and ideals of good citizenship. And then one of the last things I'll talk about is the campaign to get Eddie Grant elected into the Hall of Fame as well, that Landis attaches himself to. So shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there's an effort to try to get Eddie Grant elected into the Hall of Fame. And of course, we know that his career numbers were not the reason for that call, but it was what happened off the field. It was to induct Eddie Grant based on his ultimate sacrifice The character of Grant the Patriot, is what people like Landis wanted the writers to consider and to focus on when thinking about his worthiness into the Hall of Fame. So I guess in closing then, what I want to just try to do with my work is partly rethink a little bit of what was Landis's intents and purposes and focus in these early years as commissioner. Of course, there's gambling, but within the broader context of everything, we need to think more about what is Landis attempting to do with baseball that he sees as important for the nation. And also rethinking a little bit this legacy of the Black Sox scandal. Again, within the backdrop of all of this that's going on, how do we see why it was important to keep these 8 men, not only the ones who threw the series, but also avoided military conscription out of the game permanently. And so, of course, again, if you have any additional questions that don't get addressed here, please feel free to give me a follow on Twitter and DM me any of the questions you might have. Thank you.
Lindsay, that was fabulous. We've got several questions here in the chat, which I'll relay to you. A couple of people wanted to know about the attitude towards players of German heritage, both by their colleagues and the fans during this time that you were researching.
That is something I definitely need to look more into, as far as specific treatment towards players of German heritage. I know that because, it's interesting, sort of the duality that sports exists in, and how, in some ways, becoming a great baseball player also was validation of someone's unique Americanness, because the game was believed to be uniquely American. But I have not personally come across anything into where, any player of German heritage was, pointed at or picked out in any way as a result. Obviously that would have to take a look a little bit more to have a more definite answer. But again, I would just say that the aspect of baseball acting as an Americanizing process, those men had probably already achieved this ideal of American through the sport itself.
Okay. And here's a comment followed by a question, and I'll echo the comment. The photographic research here is really incredible. And the question is just how many different sources did you use to find so many great pictures?
Oh, well, I mean, I won't lie. It took me a little bit to put this PowerPoint together with the pictures and stuff. But I mean, some of the things I came across in my research, others I just, through like the Library of Congress has a great database. Of course, Getty Images, I use some from there as well. But the online visual repositories are pretty phenomenal if you can find them.
Gotcha. A question here from Rick asking whether or not you saw or see any connection between World War I baseball and the Spanish flu. And I guess I'll maybe extend that to see if you maybe are making any connections today with the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, and so I know that the 1919 season is delayed in its start, and it's for more, there's just like many things, right? We oftentimes try to simplify things for the sake of discussion, but there's a litany of issues that are contributing to certain events. And I know the Spanish flu, we see some of its presence at the end of 1918, and then sort of pushing into 1919. But as far as, my particular research isn't really looking at that in itself, but it is interesting to think sort of like the bigger picture that I'm talking about is like, what is baseball's importance to the nation in a time of, crisis? Because we saw with my presentation, you see this shift early on in 1917. Baseball's very important. It needs to stay there. The soldiers on the fronts, they want to keep reading about, they want to see the box scores. But by 1919, as the war is sort of dragging on, people began to, why are we still watching these men on a ball diamond when there's men dying in the trenches, right? And so like the realities of these crises that we see arise, really, I think, have people reevaluate their priorities. And I think, with what's going on now, understanding, that people, a sense of normalcy for many people is seeing sports. But, how do you ensure then that those that we look to for that entertainment, who are also individual people with loved ones and families, are also part of that process? And yeah, I know Major League Baseball is having a heck of a time with its testing right now, so I don't know if I really want to unpack that.
Well, there's no question. I mean, there will be countless research opportunities that come about from what's happening right now, and this is one avenue, the association with patriotism, no question. So a couple of people having a conversation about Eddie Grant, and pointing out that he was not the only baseball player to die in World War I. So what was it about him that what were the reasons why he got the hero's treatment specifically?
So I think it's because he was part of the rescue expedition to try to reconnect with the Lost Battalion, and it was a minor league Pittsburgh Pirates player, his name's blanking on me now, who was the first to die in a military training exercise in Texas. And so I think that the fact that, like, Grant's the first one to die on foreign soil really kind of, brought him to the forefront. And then also, I think, just the reputation he had built, like John McGraw had the utmost respect for him. Apparently he was great at laying down bunts to move runners over, so like he fit into sort of like that era of baseball that also was like speaking to a lot of like this American ideal of like working as a team and the individual that comes through in the team effort. And so there's a lot of things I think that are contributing to why Grant is singled out.
And Stephen asks a question that's probably a good wrap up here. What are the one or two takeaways that you would like the entire group to remember about this talk?
I think it's important to, one, and which SABR I know is obviously contributing to, realize that, again, this duality of sports, right? We see it as an escape from our day in and day out lives, something that's not supposed to be politicized or causes, but in reality, it's very much at times a reflection of society, and thinking about in what ways did, in this early 20th century, as this sort of modern America is coming into form, how did baseball actually play a role in constructing this American manhood on, sort of these years following the war, and how Landis in some ways is very much on the forefront of helping in that larger national discourse about what does an American man look like, what do his actions determine, or what actions determine, his legacy. And, baseball, I think, is very much, a part of this process.
Excellent. Dr. Lindsay John Bell, thank you so much. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And I hope everybody grabbed his Twitter handle while you could, and you can direct additional comments his way. While Lindsay exits and Andy enters, I get to remind you about the virtual raffle, in which if you want an opportunity to win a baseball autograph by Hall of Famer and former Commissioner Bud Selig, go ahead and check out the SABR Virtual Raffle, which you can access at sabr.org/virtual meetings. Also there, you will find the entire schedule for the remaining 9 days of sessions. We got a lot of cool stuff coming up. Before we wrap up today, I'll be sure to mention what's coming up tomorrow. But check out the entire schedule. There's a lot of cool research being presented, a lot of very fun and entertaining conversations. Andy, you've got your screen shared. Wonderful. Let me get you introduced, and we will be off and running. Andy McCue is a former president of the SABR Board of Directors. He has won the Seymour Medal for mover and shaker, Walter O'Malley, the Dodgers, and baseball's westward expansion. He is also the author of Baseball by the Books, a history and complete bibliography of baseball fiction. He is working on a tale of the American League's mismanagement of its affairs through expansion era, from the 1950s into the 1980s. Andy McCue, take it away.
Very much. Thank you, Scott. In a little less than a couple of weeks, the Seattle Mariners and the Toronto Blue Jays will begin their 44th season in a season which can only be described as kind of chaotic and unusual. And it kind of harks back to the almost a decade that preceded their creation and all of the disruptions that went into that process. I don't seem to be able to control my slides, Scott. Oh, no, there we go.
Got it? Okay, great.
Yeah, there we are. This is what the franchises looked like in 1967. The American League's biggest problem is that because the Giants and the Dodgers had beaten them to the West Coast, they are getting exceedingly beaten in the attendance race between the two leagues. And they are very conscious of that. But before the 67 season, they had changed the way they counted their attendance just to make things look better. They started counting seats sold while the National League continued the turnstile count. And this helps temporarily, but not permanently. They also have a very unhappy owner in Kansas City, probably unhappy for life, but at this point he's in Kansas City, and he has tried to move to Louisville, and they said no, and he's tried to move to Dallas, and they have said no, but all of a sudden he says he wants to move to Oakland, and since that fits in with their West Coast strategy, they let Charlie move to Oakland. But this, of course, causes a problem in Kansas City. Senator Symington starts talking about baseball's antitrust exemption. The Kansas City mayor starts threatening all kinds of legal actions. And actually, the American League had anticipated that. At the same December 1967 league meeting where they had approved Charlie's move to Oakland, they had also agreed that they would put an expansion team into Kansas City and probably somewhere else for the 1971 season. They thought this was all hunky-dory. And so the meeting breaks up and they go out, and Tom Yawkey runs into a couple of the Kansas City people in the hallway and says, well, isn't this great? We've solved all this. And they said, no, we're still really angry. We're going to have to deal without Major League Baseball for 3 years. And we don't see any reason we should do this. And we just passed a huge bond issue to placate you guys about our stadium, and ground has to be broken within a few months. And this just doesn't make sense if we have to wait till 71. So Cronin calls a rump meeting, technically probably an illegal meeting, and gets the timetable changed so there will be Major League Baseball in Kansas City for 1969. And coincidentally, they will also go into Seattle because they really are trying to build up their markets on the West Coast. Then they start to run into problems. We know from Ball 4 exactly how bad the team was on the field and in the clubhouse and in the traveling arrangements. But they also had problems just in Seattle, starting with the Six Stadium. This was a 30-year-old Pacific Coast League stadium. It had been a pretty nice stadium when it was built, but the age had not been kind to it. The city had not really maintained it very well. The American League said it had to have 30,000 seats. The city said, well, maybe 28, or frankly, really maybe 25,000 is all you're going to get. And then when they did that, it's not quite clear they made it to 25,000, and they did a poor job getting there. The seats were warping, the plumbing was backing up. It was just not a good situation at all. It was compounded by the fact that Joe Cronin, when he went to Seattle to find some owners, had gone to the baseball guy in Seattle, Dewey Soriano, who was the president of the Pacific Coast League. Dewey got his brothers together and looked around for partners, but he really just couldn't find enough money, couldn't interest enough people in Seattle. So he wound up getting 60% of his money from Cleveland, and then really didn't have a lot of money to promote the team. They had the highest prices in the league in this crummy stadium in what was, as an expansion team, inevitably not a very good team. So by the end of the year, they're in some financial trouble. It keeps going very definitely into the spring, despite the season ticket money coming in. And the American League is threatening to loan them money, but at rather stringent conditions. And finally, the Soriano brothers say, that's enough. Our only solution is to go into bankruptcy court. Well, bankruptcy court, in effect, takes it out of the hands of the American League. The bankruptcy court judge is bound to work in the interests of the creditors, and that means getting them the most money, and the most money comes from Milwaukee. This is not Milwaukee, this is what's left in Seattle. But in Milwaukee, now they have moved the franchise to Milwaukee, and inevitably, once again, you have people in Seattle who are unhappy. We will designate this as problem one. Now they have senators from both parties threatening the antitrust exemption. You have a King County executive, Seattle is in King County, who is perfectly willing to go through with the lawsuit. At one point it's in federal court, sometimes it's in local courts, but the lawsuit is filed and is there as leverage on the American League. Here's problem two, and that's the Bay Area. When Charlie Finley had moved into Oakland a couple of years before, the National League has said, you know, we really don't think there's enough people here to justify this. And now that they've been there for a decade, the Giants had averaged $1.5 million in the first 10 years they were in San Francisco, when they were the only team in town. And now Oakland comes in, and between the two teams, they average $1.56 million annually over those years, despite the fact that there were some terrific teams in Oakland in the mid-'70s, and the Giants, who were often poor in this era, actually won their division in 1971. So it looks like the National League was right. At this point, the Bay Area is not really ready for two teams. Then we have problem three. In 68-69, the original owners of the Senators 2, the expansion franchise, has sold out to Bob Short, who was from Minneapolis. And Short was a promoter kind of a guy. He hired Ted Williams as manager, talked him into managing, and Ted taught the Senators to hit, and they improved greatly in 1969. But that soon began to fade in the ensuing years, in part because Short made himself the general manager of the team. He made some disastrous trades, notably Aurelio Rodriguez and Eddie Brinkman to the Tigers for Denny McLain, who was, for various reasons, washed up at the point, and signing free agents like Curt Flood, who had more or less decided he was not going to play baseball. But Short's real problem was that, like the Sorianos, he really didn't have the money to run the team. His cash investment, the only money he really laid out to buy the team, was $1,000, and that was to buy a business license in the District of Columbia. Everything else, all the payments to the previous owners, were made with loans. Now, the collateral on those loans was all Short's companies, so he was putting out some risk, but he just didn't have the cash, the capital, to run the team and to promote it, and he was constantly complaining about that. Finally, after the 1971 season, he gets an offer from Dallas-Fort Worth, which makes him whole financially and promises more for the future, and he moves the team to Dallas-Fort Worth. This sets off some alarms, shall we say, throughout baseball, especially in the American League, because there is now no team in Washington, D.C., and as they see it, this is the possible threats not only to the antitrust exemption, but to all kinds of other legislation. There was a lot of talk at this point about new taxes on entertainment tickets and entertainment profits, and they are very concerned about that. And then there is what might call problem 3.1. Bowie Kuhn had grown up in Washington. In fact, he'd been a scoreboard operator at Griffith Stadium as a teenager. A lot of people in baseball felt that he had a real sentimental attachment to the city, wanted baseball there. He always put his arguments in terms of the legislative issues, but a lot of people around baseball who talked to him and knew him felt that there was this kind of sentimental issue. In passing, I'd like to thank the guys at RetroSheet, because there was enough information on that scoreboard on the left that I could use RetroSheet to figure out the date of the game, which wasn't mentioned in in the caption on the photo. Anyway, then we begin to get what we would call a series of variables that really kind of threw all kinds of issues up in the air through this period, through the period of the early 70s. C. Arnold Smith owned the Padres. And in this period, 72, 73, he has gotten into some trouble with his basic wealth, which is tied up in tuna canning and real estate development. As those businesses got in trouble, he began to use the bank he owned as a piggy bank. Well, the IRS and the federal banking authorities find out about this. Eventually, Smith will spend time in prison for what he's doing. The Padres are not directly involved in this. They are a separate entity financially, but of course they are an asset, and to a man in financial trouble, he needs assets to sell. So for a lot of 73, he is negotiating to sell and comes up with a group in Washington, in fact, a group which had tried to buy the Senators before Short moved them to Texas. As with the American League, with the Short move, and now the National League with the Padres, both of them think that this guy, a guy named Joe Densansky, who runs a supermarket chain, really doesn't have enough money, and so they reject his bid. So Smith is spending most of 73 trying to find himself a buyer. He's mostly focused on Washington in this period. In fact, he's so focused that when Topps puts out its 1974 baseball card set, the first group of Padres are listed as being Washington National League because they don't know where they're going to play or what their nickname is going to be. That falls through, not in time for Topps, but it falls through. And Smith then strikes a deal with the woman who owns the Hollywood Park racetrack in Los Angeles. That falls through. The day after it falls through, a guy named Ray Kroc reads in his morning paper that the Padres have not been sold. He likes baseball. He's got millions from McDonald's. So he goes ahead and buys the Padres. Well, that takes the Padres problems off the list, but also means the Washington issue has not been solved. So then we come to variables two. Stoneham's problems have become acute. The franchise is being propped up by loans from the National League, and they are happy to do that for a while, but their patience is going to be limited. And so Stoneham strikes a deal to sell the team to a group in Toronto. It's a very solid group headed by Labatt's Brewery, and that's a very attractive market. And the National League is happy that if they have to move, they're going to go there. But there's a new mayor in San Francisco named George Moscone, and Moscone definitely does not want to lose the Giants. He convinces a guy named Bob Lurie, a big real estate developer in the city, to be interested in buying the team. Lurie had been on Stoneham's board of directors for the Giants. Well, Stoneham's price is $8 million. Lurie's willing to put up $4 million at that, but no more. And so he needs a partner. He looks all around San Francisco, says he can't find anybody. Eventually he hooks up with Bob Short. Short, not at all nonplussed by his adventures in Washington and Dallas, says, yeah, I know how to run a baseball team. You've got the money. This is going to work. But the National League, having watched Short in the American League, says, no, it's not. So Short, they will do it. The NL will do it if Lurie is the only person who can go to league meeting and the only man who can vote on league issues. Short says, I'm not going to take that. He's gone. And then in truly Bobby Thompson fashion, on the very last day, March 2nd, 1976, Lurie's still thrashing around looking for a partner. He calls up the National League office and says, give me 48 more hours. The league office says, no, we'll give you 5 hours. And literally at the beginning of that 5-hour period, the mayor's office in San Francisco gets a call from a guy named Bud Herseth, a cattle guy from Arizona who nobody up there has ever heard of. They put Herseth in charge with Lurie. They talked for a couple of hours. Herseth is perfectly willing to put up the other $4 million, but only own 49% of the team so that Lurie can control it and vote with the National League. The National League is happy to approve that deal, and that means that we have now created this attractive group in an attractive city that is now part of the conversation as well. Then you've got some other variables. Calvin Griffith is talking about selling the Twins. He's talking to a banker from Minneapolis named Carl Pohlad. He won't sell the Pohlad now, but he will in the early 80s. John Allen is very much interested in selling the White Sox. The trouble is that the only buyer that he really has on his screen is named Bill Veeck, and the American League wants no part of Bill Veeck. And then the Indians are run by a partnership headed by a guy named Ted Bonda. And Bonda, the Indians have been kind of scrambling around for years. There are constant rumors that they're going to move. At this point, the main competitor seems to be New Orleans. They are unhappy, and there's a lot of uncertainty about them, as there is in a number of franchises you can see here. So in September of 1975, Bowie sits down and wants to look at all of his possible alternatives, figure out what's best. Now he's consulted with the other owners. He knows what they say. He knows the issues on the table. So possibility one, all right, we will move the Giants to Washington, D.C., solve the Bay Area problem, solve the Washington problem. 1A, we'll move the Giants to Toronto. That will snap up that market. It doesn't really deal with our current problems, but it gives us a nice new market. Or 1C, we will move the Giants to Seattle, theoretically solving the Bay Area and the Seattle problem. Okay, maybe that doesn't work, Bowie says. So let's look at it another way. Maybe we can send the A's to Seattle, again, solving the Giants and the Seattle problems. Or we can send the Giants to Toronto, picking up that market. Or, and here's a wrinkle, we'll send the A's to Chicago. And Finley will like that because all of his insurance businesses are headquartered in Chicago. And that means we'd move the White Sox to Seattle. Well, this is starting to get complicated, and Kuhn recognizes this, so he puts out some other possibilities. One, we move the White Sox to Seattle, or maybe they'd be moved to Toronto. And it's clear that we're getting into the kind of fantasy land part of the world here. And Kuhn recognizes that. It's just that the other alternative, the only alternative, and clearer and clearer and clearer, it is the only alternative, is that there's going to have to be expansion. He doesn't want that. Nobody really wants it. And if it weren't for the threat of the Seattle lawsuit, they wouldn't really be talking about it. So Kuhn's really focused on DC, but other people don't really like it. The National League has seen 2 American League franchises pull out of there in the last 15 years. In the American League, Jerry Hoffberger of the Orioles doesn't want any more competition for the Maryland suburbs of DC. And Kuhn is shaky politically. In 1975, he'd survived barely an effort led by Hoffberger and Finley to end his contract and get a new commissioner. So he's not really in place. Meanwhile, Seattle has really started to solve its problems. John Spellman has gone ahead and gotten the Kingdome built. This is not the world's greatest baseball stadium, but it will work. The NFL is there, and that's really a possibility. Probably more important, they have found an ownership group. Lester Smith owned a whole bunch of radio stations and other entertainment-oriented businesses, and his partner was Danny Kaye, who really had most of the money. But it appears to be a solid group with enough money and a real commitment to baseball. So now we come down to 1976, which is the year of decision. It starts very early in January. The American League approves the Kaye Smith Group. That would mean a 13-team league. They know in their hearts that that's a bad idea, but in public, they think a 13-league team is perfectly possible. We can work that out. The National League is totally uninterested in interleague play at this point. And many American League owners are not happy with it, but that's for the moment where it is. Then on March 2nd, the NFL approves the Laurie Herseth Group, and Toronto becomes available, which means a couple of weeks later, after discussion, the AL says, well, we'll offer a franchise to Toronto. That'll match up nicely with Seattle. The NL says, me too, we'd like to be part of that Toronto market. So then a week later, the AL formalizes the offer to the Labatt's Group in Toronto. They are now committed, they say, to Toronto and Seattle. the following Monday, 3 days later, the NL tries to put together some kind of expansion thing, but their rules require that any vote on that be unanimous, and it falls short of being unanimous. But they do ask Kuhn to hold off approving the AL move into Toronto. 2 days later, Kuhn says, I'm going to block the AL moving in Toronto if they don't make a provision for Washington. And if they don't, he'll allow the NL to go into Toronto and to the District of Columbia. The AL says we're still committed to Toronto and to Seattle. Kuhn says you've got 7 days to change your tune. 8 days later, he says he'll make a decision. The next day he doesn't make a decision. And a week after that, he gives the NFL basically the same command that you have 2 weeks to firm up your expansion plans, and it must include DC. The American League says we're still committed to Toronto and Seattle. The NL keeps its mouth shut again because of Washington. And 10 days later, the NL says, wait, we want no part of any expansion whatsoever. So there we go. We get Seattle and Toronto, and 44 years later, people in Seattle and Toronto are very happy with that. I thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Andy, that was wonderful and a ton of fun. At one point during the presentation, you said the AL wants no part of Bill Veeck, and I would argue that might have been a motto for the American League for several decades. But we've got a few questions in here, and for those that still have them, feel free to use the chat. We got a couple of that are sort of similar here. One asking about threats to move have been used to force the city's hand to fund a new stadium, asking if that was a common tactic in the 70s. Michael Hoppert maybe puts it more plainly, asking about blackmail and franchise movement. So if that's how did that play into expansion and movement?
I think it always plays into something, although sometimes oddly. Charlie Finley had used that as a tactic. Kansas City had bowed to his demand, voted to create a stadium, the stadium they have for the Royals now, as well as one for the Chiefs. And yet Finley had left anyway. And he'd left it because Oakland had already built the stadium that he wanted. And he wanted to go to Seattle rather than Oakland, but Seattle didn't have a stadium and wasn't responding to blackmail, although they would later. I think in every situation, there's always that possibility. I mean, the NFL has used it like geniuses. Baseball's record is more mixed. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it hasn't. Sometimes it hasn't been threatened. I mean, you can have a situation like Tampa, which gave in to that implied blackmail, built a stadium, and then waited, a decade, 15 years for anybody to come and take it up. So, I'd say to Mike that it's definitely a factor, but not always the primary factor. Things get involved.
Early in the presentation, you asked about, or you mentioned rather, the West Coast problem that the American League had. Melissa and Charles ask, in addition to the NL getting to the West Coast first, the National League having more African-American stars, is it possible they also were playing a higher caliber of baseball? Absolutely.
And I think that was a factor. If you look at the All-Star teams in the 70s, and whenever the NL is picking its starting lineup, there's a Hall of Famer who's being left off, if not two of them. And the American League is struggling to find players of that caliber. It's interesting to me that I think I have to check this, but of the first 3 African-American most valuable players in the American League, 2 of them were guys that had been traded from the National League the previous year. Frank Robinson in 66 and Dick Allen in 72, was it? So the talent was there. I mean, the National League had done that, and yes, very much. I think that played into it. It was more exciting baseball, but there were other factors. There was those huge markets on the West Coast, and also the National League, especially as the 70s came in, had an advantage in newer stadiums. um, that helped them as well.
Gotcha. Mark asks, did Charlie Finley make any trouble to stop the American League plan because he was not really a part of it?
Oh, I'm sorry, what American League plan are we talking about?
Well, there's a good question. Since I'm passing along someone else's thoughts, let's skip it and Mark can maybe clarify. Dirk asks, did the league consider the benefits of creating a Toronto-Montreal rivalry as part of expansion?
Toronto very much did. Toronto very much wanted to join the National League. That's why they were more interested in the Giants and the National League in general. They recognized that there was a real opportunity for a rivalry with Montreal. However, when push came to shove, the only real offer they had was from the American League, so they took it.
Gotcha. Let's see. And Mark clarifies the expansion plan. So was Finley opposed to the American League expansion plan because he wasn't really involved in it?
Finley was pretty much opposed to anything that the league wanted to do. I haven't seen anything that says he was really strongly opposed to it, but they were committed. I mean, he knew there was a problem, that the league had a problem in Seattle, and that had to be solved. So to that extent, I think he was recognizing reality, and he thought that he could make it in Oakland. I mean, it was almost a point of pride for him that he'd come in there and that he was going to make it. And of course, he was running a bare bones operation. And he hung on there for 15 years, despite making very little money.
Right. Steve asks, which two National League franchises voted against expansion in '76?
Oh my God, I've got it somewhere, but I've forgotten. I think it was the Phillies and the Reds, but don't hold me to that.
Fair enough. This is, I think that concludes all the questions that we received. Andy, that was wonderful. It was really fun to see all the machinations that went on during that period. So thank you for putting that together.
Thank you.
It was really wonderful. So coming up next, we've got the annual business meeting. Give us just a couple of minutes to get all of the board members up and running with their positions, and we will get started. Okay, Mark, I think I've added every board member as a co-host, so all of them should be able to display themselves on video and unmute. So that should be good. So I think whenever you are ready to start, the affairs are in order.
Okay, am I unmuted? Sounds like I am. Looks like I am. Okay. I will then call the meeting to order. We have about as many people as we usually have, so 147, that's not bad. So I am Mark Armour, the board president, and I would like to introduce my fellow board members, who I think are all here. Leslie Heafy, who is the vice president, and FX Flynn, the treasurer, Todd Leibowitz, secretary, and our directors, Tyrone Brooks, Emily Hawks, Allison Levin, and Bill Nowen. At the end of this meeting, Emily is leaving the board and replaced by Dan Levitt, who's also here. And I'd also like to introduce our executive director, who you all know, Scott Bush. This is my first time chairing this meeting. So this isn't the way I wanted to do this. This is the part of the meeting where, having attended many times in the past, where the board president would welcome a room full of people and talk about the host city and the hotel and ring in the start of, SABR's big event. And obviously I'm sad that I'm not doing any of those things. But I will hope I'll be doing this next year. So when we adjourned our board meeting, our most recent in-person board meeting in February, I had never felt more optimistic about SABR, really, both in the short term and long term. Then the world changed for all of us via a global pandemic and an overdue national reckoning about social justice. Both of these have affected all of us, everyone listening, and it's certainly affected SABR. But one thing we have learned, Scott and the board, is that SABR is still important to all of you. We will survive the postponement of SABR 50 because many members stepped up with donations. Our chapters can no longer meet in person, but we are instead drawing big crowds in Zoom, which is something that many of us had never even heard of 4 months ago. The virtual conference was Scott's idea, and it was a great one. And nearly every presenter who had hoped to be on stage in Baltimore this week or next week said, "Yeah, I'll do it. Tell me when." We talked very candidly. We talked about real concerns that we had that we would lose members because obviously many of you have more important life issues to deal with than SABR. But instead, SABR is growing members as much as we have in many years. Our biggest planned initiative of the year, which was the launch of the new website, went online last month and is spectacular. I hope many of you have a chance to check it out. For the first time, you can visit our website and browse and search nearly all of the best research we've ever done. I see nearly all because work continues to upload the rest and may be continuing for a long time. The site will also provide our future research an attractive home and to reach the most possible readers. It is here I must stop and pay tribute to Scott and our staff. After earning an A for 2019, essentially Scott's first year on the job, he has been asked to face challenges that none of us could have foreseen, and I cannot honestly imagine how this past 4 months could have been handled any better. He and Jacob Pomrenke and Deb Jane and Ben Rose have been working at home since March, and despite dealing with the same world as all of the rest of us, have continued to do their jobs. So we were founded in August of 1971, meaning that we will soon be entering our 50th year. We will commemorate this anniversary all year, including a hardcover book, which is coming out in the next few weeks, and a series of articles on our website. SABR is a much different organization than the one I joined in 1983 when I was in kindergarten, obviously. I could not have imagined that SABR would one day have a baseball cards committee or a games project or host panels on women in baseball. Our expansion of focus is not driven from people in management. It's not driven by the board. It's not driven by the staff. From its earliest days, members have organized themselves around projects or interests that they have seen fit. It is the job of the board and the staff to encourage and support all of our research, whether it's the Records Committee, which was founded in 1975, or the Baseball Cards Committee, which was founded in 2016. Each committee, each chapter, each project makes us all better. This is who SABR is, and this is who SABR will continue to be. We're going to get through this, and SABR 50 is going to be the best one yet, 12 months from now. Thanks for coming to the meeting. So with that, I am going to, I've already forgotten who I'm going to turn to next. FX, I think, right? So FX, our treasurer, is going to give some treasurer's remarks.
Okay, folks, I'm going to share with you the financials, and we'll just go straight to the balance sheet. I think you can read my prepared remarks in the materials. Basically, we're in a very good position. We've been running some very nice surpluses the last 2 years. We've got lots of positives, and of course, we've been thrown a gigantic curveball with the pandemic, and we've done some significant expense cutting, and we'll look at all that next. However, in terms of the balance sheet, I really wanted to point out that there are a couple of new things on here, because Mark Rucker made us the gift of his archive, and that has increased our research collections asset by $300,000. And to balance that out in the retained surplus section, we are now going to carry a donor-restricted, temporarily non-cash amount of $300,000 to balance that off. So that's pretty much the biggest difference year to year, and a new line in our balance sheet. And right now, we're a $1.2 million organization. The fact that we took the Rucker archive in like this has caused me to review the way we're valuing some of the other research assets that we have, and indeed whether or not we are valuing all of the research assets that we have. So that's a project that I will be working on with Scott and our accounting firm this summer, so that when we go into our budget season this autumn, that's all squared away. But I would anticipate that you'll see some additional changes in that area next year. I don't believe that there's going to be a large material effect, but this is something we really have not done since probably 2007. Okay, on to our operating budget. Now, whoops. Okay, in terms of what we are doing to deal with the pandemic, whoops, sorry about that. We had a $1 million budget going into this year, and now we have an $800,000 budget. We are obviously not going to see the revenues or the expenses that we would ordinarily see for the convention and for all of the other events that we run this year. I'm very grateful and excited to see that we're probably going to exceed our budget number for membership dues, reflecting membership growth. We believe that we are going to hit our budget for donation and development support. We did apply for and we did receive $75,000 from the Federal Payroll Protection Program, which was psychologically I think, a huge boost for Scott and the board, because we were quite concerned about the kind of a hole that we were facing once we had to cancel Baltimore, at least for this year. I should say postpone. Anyway, looking into some of the expense savings, obviously we're going to save a lot on our travel this year. We're going to save quite a bit on board meetings because we're not traveling to them. And then the expenses for the events, as I said, are not going to be hit. So right now we're actually looking at somewhat of a better bottom line than we had originally planned for, and that is nothing but a good thing, because it's still quite uncertain how events are going to play out through 2021. Going back to the budget sheet, the balance sheet, we have about $380,000 in the bank. Call it, if you add the 50 that we look like we're going to make this year, that puts us at about 400 some odd. And that means that we do have something of a cushion for surviving a year without the events again. Although I would imagine that we've got to find some way of providing them virtually, as we're experimenting and doing during these weeks. But of course, we're not really seeing any revenue from that. So I can't tell you what the future is, but I can tell you that at least for the rest of this year and for next year, we really do not have to worry about our ability to survive and continue the programs that we have now. And that would be my message. My basic message would be one of reassurance for you all in the membership. And with that, I want to echo and second everything that Mark has said about our staff this year. And I really want to thank each and every one of you who has, because I know that of all the people who are in this room, my guess is something close to 100% of you have extended yourself a little bit to help support SABR through this year. And I certainly am deeply appreciative of it. And I know everybody on the board and staff are as well. So thank you very much.
FX, real quick before you stop screen sharing, there are a couple of questions here that are specific to the financials that I think it's just easiest to take now.
Sure.
Before we get to the rest of the Q&A. So the first comes from Michael, and I'll chime in on this. The question is, where does the Rucker valuation come from? And that's a really good question, and it's not the sort of collection that would be very easy to put a real valuation on, because ultimately it's something that you literally could not replace if we were to lose it in a disaster, for example. So our approach was to simply take a look at what the collection would look like under liquidation, and therefore we assigned roughly $3 per image to everything that Mark donated. Going beyond a $300,000 valuation, it would have increased some of our insurance overhead, things like that. And again, without much real reason, because it's not the sort of collection that we could replace if we did actually have a loss in an insurance claim. I don't know, FX, if you want to chime in any further than that.
No, Scott, that I think is quite clear. Thank you.
Okay, and then a question from from Tim Ehrlich, and maybe it's a case of we weren't looking at the spreadsheet in the right place, but he's saying events income was budgeted at over a $500,000 increase over 2019.
Yeah, but 2019 actual was 377. We had budgeted 506
Gotcha.
For this year.
And there were two things driving that, Tim. One is a planned East Coast convention, which everyone understands is always more well attended than a West Coast, where we were in San Diego in 19. And then the other, we had planned to add Diamond Dollars case competition events to what we had done in the past, all of which obviously got pulled out in the revised projections. So great. Then we can, I think we can move on to the next piece here, Mark. That's the only financial questions I'm seeing.
Okay, so next up is Todd, who is going to give the teller's report.
Great, thanks everybody. I know this is always filled with suspense, and you're always anxious to hear the results of the election that you heard a couple of months ago. So with enthusiasm, I will repeat that Leslie Heafy has been reelected as Vice President, and FX Flynn has been reelected as Treasurer. We welcome Dan Levitt to the board, who was elected as a Director at Large in a 5-way contested race. And everybody received significant support in that race, which was encouraging to see so many people vying for an open seat. This is the seat that's being vacated by Emily. Thank you to the Tellers Committee members, Stephen Barnes, Richard Kirshner, and Kevin Schlinder for certifying the results in a May 5th virtual meeting. And thank you to the Nominations Committee, Anthony Salazar, Lorene Kennard, and Clayton Truder for their help in preparing the candidate statements. And with that, I hand the baton back to Mark.
Thanks, Todd. So I think I'm just going to quickly pass that hot baton to our CEO, Scott Bush.
All right, thanks, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. This certainly was not the way I expected to address all of you this summer, but I am incredibly grateful to our members and our research presenters who have ensured we retain our sense of community in light of the postponement of convention. While you may choose your own adjective to describe our current times, unprecedented, uncertain, challenging, extraordinary, SABR has been pushing forward and is positioned to traverse whatever adjective may come our way. 2019 was a period of meaningful growth for SABR. The organization saw an increase in members for the first time since 2015. Today, we are more than 5,900 strong and should surpass 6,000 members for the first time since 2016 before year's end. We also were able to grow our organizational capacity in 2019, launching a development department and 3 new volunteer committees, the Friends of SABR, our membership ambassadors, and a newly formed editorial board. Financially, the organization grew its cash reserves while funding a redesigned website. The new SABR.org features a search engine which will allow visitors to more easily find the content and information they are looking for and spend more time with us. This is an important step in pursuing SABR's vision for becoming the essential community for the world of baseball. This vision is supported by the efforts and contributions of many, but I want to mention 3 specific groups today. The SABR Board of Directors has begun work on a 5-year strategic plan. This will create a roadmap for the future of SABR and help us make decisions that build upon one another while continuing to fulfill our mission. A group of chapter leaders, along with Board Vice President Leslie Heafy, are working on ways to enhance the membership experience at the chapter level. This work will help build a stronger community through increased collaboration between chapters, as well as between chapters and headquarters. Finally, Our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee continues to help guide the organization on matters of social significance. Their stewardship and recommendations are vital to fulfilling our vision. Becoming the essential community for the world of baseball is only possible if that community welcomes the entire world. Before I cede my time, my virtual time, I want to thank several people for their contributions over the last year plus. The SABR Board of Directors, particularly Mark Armour and Leslie Heafy, for providing a great deal of support and latitude in which to operate. Jeremy Beer, Phil Bolda, Ed Fong, and Marlene Vogelsang for tireless and sage volunteer support. And finally, the SABR staff, Deb Jane, Jacob Pomrenke, and Ben Rose for helping the organization navigate a lot of change. Thanks to you all. Mark.
Okay, so I think this was the time you were going to field some of the questions that had come in, Scott.
Let's do that.
Yes.
I've got them here, and then I do see we do have interest in submitting other questions in the chat, which is great. It was wonderful to get some questions in advance because I think it helped shape my remarks and Mark's remarks because we could know and understand what we wanted to answer later. So this might be something that we try to spin forward. So the first question to the group is, what plan has the SABR board developed for fostering closer working relations with chapters? I touched on this a bit in my remarks, but I think maybe Leslie, if you would like to share with everyone what we've been working on.
Thanks, Scott. Sure, I'd be happy to. Since the convention last year, we had sent out a survey to all the chapter leaders after interviewing many of them and created a working committee that has been working for the last few months now, preparing a proposal and plans to work on providing resources, leadership opportunities, materials that are necessary, determined by chapter leaders themselves, to provide the kind of support that they need, looking to the idea that one of the things we want to create for membership through the chapters is a more common experience for everybody, regardless of where they are and what part of the country they're in, internationally, et cetera, when they join SABR. And so I think out of this group, what we're going to see are some very exciting new ideas about resources, about training materials, about opportunities for cooperation and joint meetings among chapter leaders. We're already seeing some of that already, as we've seen many of you have participated in a lot of the virtual meetings that have been taking place. And we're seeing an increase as people get a little more familiar, and we're hoping to continue to provide the support for those kinds of things to continue as well. It makes it easier for some of the cooperation that we're seeing. One of the things we're looking at, for example, is the creation of a speakers bureau, some of those kinds of ideas, creating better connection and more opportunities for support from national headquarters to the chapters. So those are some of the kinds of things that we are working on to help support the chapters.
Excellent. That is a much better summary than I would have come up with. So thank you for handling that. Our next question, how many members do we have now compared to last year? And what is the average age of the members? So year over year is always a tricky conversation because of the fact that we now are on rolling membership. When the organization used to be on an annual membership, that was a lot easier thing to ascertain. So the way that I'll share that to the questioner and to the group, when we did the annual report last year, we were at 5,067 members. When we did the annual report this year, we were at 5,780. And so true year over year, we were plus 400. I shared earlier, we're over 5,900 in the time from writing the annual report to today, which is excellent. And just based on the tracking and the pace that we have for this year, I fully anticipate will be well over 6,000 come year's end, which again would be the first time we've been there since 2016. In terms of age, that is even trickier because you rely on the data entry of folks when they're signing up. So I prefer to look at it more in terms of the overall share of membership types. And so if you look at the annual report this year, one significant change we've made is we're identifying the quantity of members that we have inside of each membership type. And those are going to be the metrics moving forward that we pay attention to with regard to age. And we are working a lot within the strategic plan and within the work that we're doing with the chapters on how we can do a better job of creating relationships and fostering the sense of community for both students and young professionals to make SABR a more attractive organization to be a part of for those age groups. So I know that we have grown in those areas in the last year. However, I don't think we're really remotely close to where we would like to be. And so that's the sort of thing every year during the annual business meeting, every year in the annual report, we're going to want to be paying attention to that as an organization to see if we are growing there. Next question. What, if any, alternative arrangements have been considered in the event that the public health conditions do not permit the safe execution of mass in-person events in 2021? This is something that I would say within the last month has grown to be has become a growing concern for myself and the board. When we moved forward with the 2019 SABR Analytics Conference and shifted into a hybrid of an in-person event, but more so a virtual streamed experience, we did so with a bit of a naive assumption that it would be the only tangible change to our programming for this year. And we're likely to have effects for next year. I will say I have been incredibly encouraged and grateful to the chapters and research committees who have embraced virtual events. I think it makes for a much stronger organization because we are seeing people be able to participate in our organization who otherwise may have had geographic limitations. And I think that's a fabulous thing. And we're seeing, based on the interest and appetite for SABR Virtual, that there will be an audience for a virtual convention if we put it together, and if that's what we're forced to do. So what we have done thus far, we are currently investigating vendors that would put together a much more polished and professional virtual event experience than simply using Zoom. That would provide us with the level of experience that I would feel comfortable actually charging a fee to attend. Obviously, a registration fee for an event like that would pale in comparison to an in-person event held at a major convention hotel. So we certainly wouldn't envision a scenario where SABR 50 is held virtually and the price point is similar to what you've come to expect. But it is very important that we investigate the right experience so that people know that they can expect what they've always gotten, which is a boatload of research presentations, great opportunities to meet as research committees, and most importantly, the social aspect that has been a driving force behind SABR conventions for many years. And so if we can check those boxes, I expect us to put on really, really great analytics programming and really great convention programming if necessary. The next question to really FX, I think, is the best person to answer this. What detailed financial arrangements were made by the board with Ancestry.com for access to valuable baseball research content? Will the Bill Weiss questionnaires be made available to SABR members on sabr.org, or will members be required to subscribe to Ancestry?
Okay, well, the deal that we have with don't want you to have to listen. Oh, geez. Sorry, I thought I'd hit the button. I apologize, folks. Anyway, the deal we made with Ancestry involves a period of time where they have exclusive use of the materials. And once that is over, we would be able to put them on our website. So that is not something, we're not going to even start to look at that until 2022 or later. Their model for providing access to organizations that are providing them with data are predicated on an in-person model. And I have been investigating ways that we could possibly set up a virtual office in the Amazon cloud or in the Azure cloud, and then have that tied to your membership login so that there would be a seamless experience. I was actively pursuing that this winter, and after COVID hit, it went on the back burner. If there is anyone in the audience who's got some skills and interest in that area, either in terms of project management or in terms of cloud-based application development, please find me in the SABR directory and reach out to me. I could use your help with that. The Ancestry model is quite interesting in terms of the way it works as far as cash goes. They make a big investment in digitizing materials, and then they measure the hits that are being generated throughout their whole system, and then they divvy that up among the people who are providing the data. As it stands right now, the Weiss questionnaires have not generated a measurable amount of cash. I'm also looking at adding all of the sporting news player contract cards and the data behind that. So, you know, I guess the answer is right now that's available if you have an Ancestry subscription, or if you can use one at your local library or your local Latter-day Saints church. If you or if you have your own account, and that sometime later in this decade, it'll be more accessible through the SABR website, although that will require us to make some level of investment. So it will depend on you know, whether or not we have the resources, both financially and in terms of time. So I hope I've covered all that. Scott, do you think that answered the question in full?
I believe it did. I believe
Okay.
it did. So the final question that we took in advance, and then we'll see if there's time to grab questions from the chat as well, is about the 2021 convention, assuming we do have it in person. So the dates that we have already announced and booked the hotel for, actually, sorry, I just lost my screen for a second. Sorry, everyone. That we've already announced and booked the hotel for do not coincide with an Orioles home game. We are aware of this situation. Our circumstances with the hotel in Baltimore required us to act as quickly as possible, because it was our goal to hold convention in Baltimore in 2021 if 2020 would not allow. So we went to the hotel very quickly following the analytics conference. This was probably the first week of April that we made this move, and asked them to allow us to rebook our previously booked event. And when we went to them with that, they came back. They only had 3 weekends for the entire summer of 21 available. One we identified as too early in June for our group, and the other we identified as too late in August for our group. And so the weekend that we booked was the best inventory available. And we went forward knowing that it was definitely a gamble in terms of baseball schedule. We have been working very, very closely with the Orioles. They're incredibly supportive of our group and our event. And regardless of dates, I anticipate that we will get time as a group privately inside Camden Yards for programming. Obviously, that's not a game. The good news is the Nationals are home the weekend that we've currently booked. I will also share that we are working with the hotel to identify if there is a date that we could shift to that the Orioles would be home and potentially have our cake and eat it too. But it's too early today to know if that's possible. But based on the inventory we were provided in April, I do not think that it's particularly likely that we will be able to change dates, unfortunately. So that is the update on Baltimore. And we would indeed bus then to the Nats game. That would we would endeavor to go to a major league game. So, okay, great. Are there any additional questions? I'm trying to scroll through for additional questions from attendees here. Steve asks, Steve has kind words to say about SABRcast. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. And was asking if we have a feel for listenership. So I don't check it every day for my own personal self-esteem. But the last time I did look, we typically average over 1,000 downloads a week, which means that on an annual basis, SABRcast typically has a larger audience than our books, which is an interesting comparison and a good use of our publishing efforts, I think. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think.
Scott, there was a question about the Diamond Dollars and kind of how that might work. There were 3 or 4 questions related to that.
Okay, sure. So Diamond Dollars is on hiatus as obviously college campuses are trying to figure out how they're navigating all of this, and it really is working on these cases is something best done together and in person. And so what we have elected to do, and I say we, I'm referring to former board president Vince Gennaro, who founded Diamond Dollars. What Vince and I have decided to do is put expansion on hiatus until there's additional clarity around what college campuses are going to look like. So I would expect that if possible, we will continue to pursue our expansion plan in 21. But that plan, just as a recap for folks, was to add regional events for the Diamond Dollars case competition above and beyond what is currently held in Phoenix in person as part of the analytics conference. And we did have to pivot into virtual presentations for this year's analytics conference anyway. And so what we have learned is we may not have to conduct these events on site in the future. We may be able to do them remote, but we do believe pretty strongly that the schools will have to be back to normal, so to speak, before we will see teams interested. Stephen's asking about really a publication schedule for the rest of 2020 and the rest of 21. This is actually a very well-timed question, Stephen, because we have convened, as I mentioned earlier, our first editorial board. In addition to that, we have also established a volunteer group who will handle marketing and PR efforts around SABR publications, which has been a shortcoming of resources, really, on the part of the headquarters staff to be able to execute plans like that. So having a volunteer group who's going to do that is invaluable. And the things that they're going to do is really identify local marketing opportunities, because many of our books are team focused. It lends itself to finding groups, podcast hosts, things like that, that are focused on a specific team that we can go and tell about our publication and have our contributors be a part of an interview and outreach like that. So what we've been able to do is we have, within the editorial board, we have established a tentative timeline for the balance of 2020 and for 21. And we are handing that same tentative schedule off to that marketing group so that they can get their, they can start to get their ducks in a row for how they want to do outreach. So all of that is a long-winded way of saying, Stephen, that's something that we can share publicly, and we'll do so within the next month, along with new guidelines on how to submit proposed publications projects.
I saw three other questions. One were whether there was plans to license material from the Rucker Archive. Another was, has there been a parliamentarian appointed for this meeting? And the third one is whether the age of SABR members has come down from.
So the second question is Mark's problem. The first question was about.
I appointed Mike McCulloch in the chat, so we're all set.
Very good. The first question regarding the Rucker Archive. Yes, we do want to license the photographs. At its core, the Rucker Archive is a publishing collection. However, it is our endeavor to try to digitize those works. We had originally made arrangements with Arizona State University and their library system to both host the collection but oversee the digitization efforts of archiving the collection. Ultimately, what we would like to create is to put the Rucker Archive inside of our overall collection search that the new website does a really great job with. But step one is digitizing this. And so we're sort of back at square one with that effort because ASU has a very uncertain next few months. And so what I'm looking at is alternatives that we can pursue there. And Mark has been a great resource on figuring that out. And I believe, Bill, the third question about age I answered earlier. There's a question here, Mark, that maybe you would love to take on. What is SABR's biggest challenge?
Well, we have a lot of challenges, which is, the reason why we want to serve. But I think since it hasn't come up in this meeting, I think I would like to mention that we have spent quite a bit of time in recent years, but especially in recent weeks, dealing with the issue of SABR becoming more diverse. And we formed a committee about this a couple of years ago, and we have, put in some policies for our events and whatnot. But in recent weeks, we have a committee which is ongoing, which is chaired by Anthony Salazar, and includes a number of people, 4 other people, including a few on the board, Leslie and Tyrone and Emily, and Larry Lester. And they are off coming up with some, hopefully, proposals to pass back to us for our hopefully approval, to not just make SABR more inviting for people to join, but also more inviting for people to participate in and do presentations and write and the whole thing, so that SABR, much like the rest of America, can become just a better and more friendly place for anyone, no matter what their demographic is. So I think we've talked about this for a long time, and I hope that a year from now that we will be able to tell you that we've made some progress on some initiatives. So that's probably our biggest challenge at the moment.
Very good. That seems to be it. If you would like to maybe go to the next part of our program.
Okay, so the next, we've just got a couple things left. And one of them is I would like to turn the microphone over to Leslie Heafy, who has a few words to say.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. Thanks, everybody. I just want to take a few moments to say a few words of thanks to Emily Hawks as she steps down from the board directly after this meeting today. After 7 years, Emily joined the board in 2013 as an appointment and has been a great member, colleague, and friend. Emily has brought a new voice and perspective to SABR's actions and ideas that has been much needed. Emily, you've been a voice of reason, balance, and challenge over the 7 years to things that SABR has done. I personally will miss our discussions and our after-meeting talks. I asked, as we have a tradition at our university that I particularly like, which is to invite others to also add comments. And so I talked to the staff and invited the board, and I wanted to share a few remarks with you, Emily. The staff said it was an absolute pleasure to work with you. They appreciated your insight and perspectives in helping guide SABR through many challenges and changes. A number of things that everyone highlighted was your work in organizing our code of conduct and working to develop our diversity initiatives. Other board members appreciated your leadership in the search that helped bring Scott to SABR, and all agree that you will be missed on the board. We look forward to continuing to work with you on varieties of SABR committees, new opportunities, and just want to thank you, Emily, for all you've done for SABR, and know that on the board, you're going to be missed. And I think, Mark, you have something that you want to share so we can show Emily that there will be a small gift coming your direction, and it should arrive hopefully in Seattle this coming week.
I thought Jacob was going to do it. Is Jacob
Oh, is Jacob going to do it? I didn't know who was going to share it.
Oh, maybe I am supposed to do it. Yeah, I think maybe you're right. Let me see if I can find it.
While Mark is looking for that, I truly just simply, Emily, you have been a great voice on the board, and hope to continue to hear that voice as SABR continues to face challenges and knows that that there's always need for change. And so simply just really want to thank you. It's been a true pleasure.
Well,
If other
thank
people
you for
want,
that, Leslie.
if anybody wants to fill time and say nice things about Emily while I find this,
I don't know if I could handle that, but no. But thank you so much for saying that, and it's been a pleasure to serve on the board this last 7 years, and you won't be getting rid of me that easily, though. I'll still be around.
Well, that was the most important thing we wanted to hear, Emily, is we're not going to, and we all decided we're not going to let you get away anyway. So the continued opportunities to work with you. Here it is. So, Emily, this is what will be arriving. It says,
wow.
I don't believe it. No, my, they're going crazy at the Kingdom. October 8th, 1995, Mariners versus the Yankees.
Wow.
So
this is good timing. My dog, Edgar, just walked in. So
that's perfect. So that should arrive this coming week for you, Emily. And again, just simply wanted to say thank you for everything that you've done. So to date, and what we know you will continue to do for SABR.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would say on a personal note, I can't tell you the number of times I have told Emily in the past few months, like, well, you're not leaving this committee, are you? You're not stopping doing this, are you? So yeah, we're still going to bother her quite a bit, I hope.
I look forward to it.
So thanks very much to Emily. So that concludes the business part of our meeting. And the one final thing that I'm going to do, we normally give out the Bob Davids Award at our banquet, which of course we're not going to have this year. So we, tried to figure out the best way to do it, and we had a lot of options, and this is the one we decided on. So hopefully it'll be appreciated. So we'll see. So I am going to conclude the meeting with this. The Bob Davids Award honors SABR members whose contributions to SABR and baseball reflect the ingenuity, integrity, and self-sacrifice of the founder and past president of SABR, L. Robert Bob Davids. Voluntary activities in the areas of administration and research are among those contributions considered. SABR's highest honor, the Bob Davids Award, was established by the Board of Directors in 1985 and is awarded each year at the annual convention. There are many Davids Award winners present, and we usually ask each of you to stand, but we will forego that practice this year. But just trust me, there are some of them on the call. The awards committee this year was Larry Lester and Larry McCray and Bill Lamb. And because of the complex logistics involved, they asked me to present the award this year. So the winner of the 2020 Bob Davids Award is Peter Mancuso. I will pause briefly for what would be a standing ovation. Peter, I see Peter's face there. He seems okay. So I will continue. Peter joined SABR more than 20 years ago and has since become one of our leading lights. Most visibly, he became chair of the 19th Century Committee in 2007 after a period of dormancy and restored it to its rightful position as one of SABR's finest and most active. Upon the untimely death of Fred Ivor Campbell in 2009, Peter has presided over the enlargement of the annual 19th Century Conference, now known as the FRED, a Cooperstown gathering beloved by the attendees fortunate enough to sign up before it sells out. Peter was also instrumental in the institution of the biannual 19th Century Symposiums that have brought together baseball scholars and local academics for baseball conferences in New York, Philadelphia, Minneapolis, and other places. He has managed the annual naming of a 19th century overlooked legend, which probably led to Deacon White's election to the Hall of Fame in 2013, and a highly successful grave marker project. On Peter's watch, the committee has put out a research-packed newsletter and authoritative volumes on the game's early founders, clubs, and games. Peter's written many articles for SABR himself. More important than any of that, all three members of the committee asked me to stress that Peter is a great mentor, teammate, and friend, and that his collegiality is the prime reason for the brilliant success of all of these endeavors and his committee. It is with great personal pleasure that I present the 2020 Bob Davids Award to Peter Mancuso. Peter, you have the floor.
Well, I am absolutely honored and humbled. I am not exactly speechless, but close to it. My family here, my son just walked in here with this amazing trophy that they've been hiding from me, obviously. It's the Bob Davids trophy. And I will say something about this trophy, that when you look at it, it's a kind of magical trophy in a way. Because when you look at it, you don't see your reflection. I see the reflection of the scores and scores and scores of SABR members and friends that really, really makes me feel more. I'm truly the bat boy of that committee. It's a wonderful committee with some wonderfully dedicated people. And all of the people I've met in SABR over the years have just been, it's kind of unfair to love history and love baseball and then find an organization that allowed you to combine all that, combine all of that. And then now I have this tremendous honor. I just don't know what to say. But other than thank you so very much, I will treasure this, of course, all of my life. Thank you.
Great, Peter. Really happy for you. I'm sure we all are. And one promise I'll make is that next year, hopefully, we'll be together in Baltimore, and you'll be there, and you'll have an opportunity to come up on stage, and you'll hear the applause for real.
Well, this was a wonderful thing anyway. It's just amazing that you've done this and been able to do this. And I think Virtual SABR has a very good future. I really do.
Great. So I think that concludes the business that we plan to have here today. And therefore I move that we adjourn. Bill now has seconded. All those in favor? Okay, that is 8-0. Thanks everybody for coming, and I hope that everyone's enjoying SABR Virtual. We're up tomorrow morning, or no, for me it is 3 o'clock Eastern and noon Pacific tomorrow. Hopefully a lot of you guys will check in. Have a good day.